Good afternoon. So I'm Samantha Shellard. I'm the Works on Paper Conservator here at QAGOMA. And my role in Transparent was actually to assess the condition of over 160 watercolours that we have on show. And this involved a close examination of the actual surface of each of those works and just determining what needed repair, what needed treatment, and what needed cleaning. So we were very fortunate to actually have 5 new acquisitions that could be incorporated into the show, and they're stunning additions. And particularly, I'll bring your attention to the gifted and vibrant composition of Saltwater Lagoon by LWK Wove. So that was a really lovely thing to actually sort of come into the collection. So during this process, we've actually had numerous discoveries, just in terms of annotations underneath the actual window mounts. And we've identified 2 period frames belonging to the artworks of Cooma River by Edward Bode, and also another work, Castle Hill, Townsville, North Shore by William Buster. And those will actually require further frame conservation by our artisan framer, William Zilly, and they will actually be completed for the back galleries. So we'll actually be able to actually show those off. So today I hope to share with you an insight into the artist materials used for watercolours and the evolution of both the manufacture and of watercolour paints and the production of fine artist papers over the last 200 years. So in the purest sense, watercolour is a medium which uses pigments dispersed in water bound in gum. That's applied to a brush, to a paper support. So all of that seems fairly straightforward and simple. So the conventional support is paper, and it's usually held flat and taut, and preferably a textured surface, and with the right degree of absorption to allow a controlled application of thin watercolour wash. The choice of colour paper is almost always white or cream, as the lightness of the paper is reflected through the sheer layer of the applied colour, providing the desired brilliance from these pigments. So initially, pigments were actually extracted from minerals and plants and ground by hand and stored in shells. The gum, customarily gum arabic, was mixed to enhance the working properties of pigments. Watercolour was originally simply a way of actually being able to tint prints and drawings, since its transparency allowed the underlying structure of the ink and the actual pencil lines to remain visible. So prior to the 18th century, it's been necessary to grind and mix the paints by hand, combining the pigments with gum and water using a muller. So we've got a muller down here, so the glass muller is here, on a glass plate. Watercolour washes are fine dispersions. They're actually solid particles in water, so they're not dyed water. The smaller the particles are, the longer they stay in suspension. So organic pigments such as indigo and madder have very small particles. So the resulting paints, you can actually handle them much more easily, and they compared to those that have a more granular quality. So for instance, when you're looking at blues, which have notoriously difficult in terms of the different handling, so you have Prussian blue and indigo, which actually create very easy washes and are easily applied. But those blues such as cobalt and ultramarine still have a very grainy texture. And so when Glenn was talking about the J.J.Hilder, you notice that he was actually talking about how the actual paint actually laid into the furrows of the actual paper itself. Those because the actual blues that he's used are the cobalt and the ultramarine. So they deposit a very sort of grainy sediment. So from the late 18th century onwards, it became simpler and more convenient to buy pigments ready-made from specialist suppliers known as colourmen. Several now well-known British firms such as George Rowland, the Thomas Reeves, Winsor and Newton manufactured these ready-to-use pigments. Available from the 18th century, these catalogues included watercolours that were made from synthetic materials. So you actually sort of had a succession of advances in terms of science and technology, in terms of pigments being available. So you start with cobalt, which came in 1802, to emerald green in 1814. So there's all a succession of pigments becoming available to artists, through to a lot of the artificial earth pigments such as Mars Red, French ultramarine in the 1830s, zinc white, and then a range of chrome and cadmium colours, sort of all the way through to sort of 1840s. So these are sort of illustrations of so they came quite popular. They actually were talking about the fact that you know, in a succession of, say, a 20-year period, millions of these sort of small coloured boxes of the small watercolour cakes were actually sold. So the more familiar colours were made into pre-prepared pans or cakes, and these were kept moist and easily worked with their humidants. They basically sort of make them ready to take on the moisture from the water with wetting agents such as honey and iron ore. So these pre-prepared cakes and pans were often stamped with the marks. So you can see some of the marks there of the Reeves logo. And these paints could be presented in appealing boxes and containers, and they were fitted so that there was extra sort of areas for both your brushes and ceramic porcelain dishes. But there was also a real push for whole equipment, so in terms of furniture, so whole drawing tables were actually made and fitted out with watercolour paints, and these drawing desks were growing in popularity and obviously reflected the wealth of a lot of the watercolourists. So initially regarded as a medium for amateurs, the status of watercolours grew through the 19th century. Less expensive and less cumbersome than oils, watercolours were ready to use and were demanded by a broad market, allowing both amateurs and professionals to purchase them at affordable prices. As watercolours entered the golden age, the status of the professional watercolourist soared. Many of the artists supplemented their incomes by teaching and writing manuals for watercolour painting. Within these artist manuals, you got manufacturers actually had their actual catalogues where they had coloured swatches. So they were in amongst the actual shelling, the shelling manuals. And so this is quite an early list of pigments that were available. So you can see 1835. Many of the artists avoided pre-mixing watercolours as the palettes they tend to deaden the palette, so a lot of the actual mixing was actually done on the actual paper itself. So instead, the purity of the pigment can be maintained by building up the layers of wash. So this kind of technique actually sounds very deceptively easy and simple, but it requires a real virtuosity in terms of handling and technique. It means that by actually building up those layers, you can actually create those areas of atmosphere and light. So when we think of those really atmospheric works of the famous British watercolourist Turner, and so those are those sort of really beautiful sunsets where they sort of merge and are actually sort of just fantastic in terms of actually capturing the actual enigmatic sort of landscape. So in the 19th century, many new and exotic pigments became available. Unfortunately, many were unstable, particularly the aniline dyestuffs. The permanence of watercolours became a very controversial and debated subject, and questions were raised about quality and purity and permanence. And the publics were actually concerned, and eventually in 1835, you actually had the publication of George Fell's chromography. This was the first truly scientific investigation of artist pigments. So he actually started as a colourman and a scientist, and so he was actually looking at these problems in a very rigorous manner. And it was a very influential book. It actually went through all the way through the 1800s and had 15 editions, and was pretty much at the side of most professional watercolourists in terms of actually them providing an insightful commentary on the essential issues of the actual watercolours that were then available. So by 1888, you actually had the British government commissioning a report providing information about the light effects of watercolour, the action of light on watercolours. And so this had a very far-reaching effect in the fact that it actually established a lot of the modern ways of actually dealing with the actual display, and a lot of the conservation groundwork was actually done in terms of making recommendations in terms of standard times to actually display works. So although you actually can notice with the actual watercolours that you can actually create that beautiful vibrance, it's through light exposure, when you actually look and take up the window mount, you can actually often see the contrast between a lot of the areas in sky and just those areas, because they've actually been protected by the light. You get those margins underneath the window mount, which actually show the actual true colour scheme, the actual intention of the artist. So what you find is that through the action of light, there's actually the fading of the actual pigments itself, and also the actual paper support darkening. So it changes the tonal contrast in the actual image, and you'll notice that throughout some of the works in the collection. Some of the actual colour tonings might be a little bit shifted, particularly the Conrad Martins, and I make reference to that in the exhibition catalogue. There's an essay which actually deals with that in a little bit more detail. So modern pigments, majority of modern pigments actually have a synthetic origin. They're usually machine ground to ensure a homogeneous composition. And there's an abundance, as you'd appreciate, anyone who's actually practicing watercolour today, there's an abundance of technical manuals in terms of the actual techniques, and this just is an attest to the popularity and accessibility of the medium itself. So aside from the paints, the most crucial component for the art of watercolour is its paper. So we have here a typical setup for handmade paper. So you can see in the foreground, you can see the Batman. So the actual pulp has been is actually sort of been macerated so that it's actually in a suspension. In the vat, he's actually got the mould, shifting it in back and forth in the actual mould itself. He actually drains it of the excess liquid, passes it to his friends behind, and they actually couch it onto felts. So there's a real art and skill in terms of actually dealing with the actual paper sheet itself, and then it's actually put in a press, and actually the excess water is actually rid of the actual sheet itself. So they would continue interleaving each sheet with a felt. So almost all paper prior to the 18th century would have been done in this manner. So that's the traditional way that handmade paper was made. It was made with raw rag, linen rags predominantly. And this is when paper demand was low. So the most revolutionary development in the manufacture of paper for watercolour was the invention during the second half of the 18th century. This is wove paper. So what we have here on your left is lathe paper, and this is wove paper. So prior to this time, all paper was laid. So meaning that when you actually have this is the actual mould itself. When the mould actually collects the actual paper pulp, you actually have the actual pulp, the actual alignment of the actual mould itself has this sort of rib-like pattern that you see up here. And it's impressed into the sheets. And so when a watercolour wash is applied to that, you actually find that the watercolour wash sort of tends to go into those furrows. So it doesn't create an overall even application. And so what was developed was a woven wire cloth, and that sat over the top of the actual mould itself. And this was developed by James Watman Jr. And it just created an even surface to the actual paper itself. So it meant that the watercolour wash was, it was actually, when it was applied to the paper, it created a uniform area of colour. So we have also, due to the inherent transparency of the actual watercolour wash itself, the actual paper support itself plays an active role in the appearance of the actual picture. So, and actually affecting the actual image itself. So if you have a paper that's too absorbent, so for instance like blotting paper, you actually find that the actual pigment itself sinks into the actual paper itself, and it doesn't sit on the top. So the best papers for watercolour are those that are generally sized. And that means that they're actually treated with a substance. And there's a number of different ways that they're actually treated. And it means that it's less absorbent, and it actually it allows the actual watercolour wash itself to actually sit on the surface of the actual paper sheet. So the English paperman J. Watman became famous in the 18th and 19th century, not only because they developed the actual wove paper and the fact that they actually created all of the actual different textures that were actually available to the different watercolours. But what they also became very preferred and renowned for is their hard-sized gelatin sheets. And so what they actually not only introduced the actual sizing when it was actually being formed in the vat, where we saw earlier, but then they also, once it had actually had that initial drying period, it will actually then be put into another vat, so that would be surfaced sized, and so it would just be on the surface of the actual paper itself, and then loft dried. So that's where and basically it meant that that top sizing layer on the surface of the paper meant that a lot of the techniques, particularly through the 1800s, involved a lot more rigorous scraping and actually manipulation of the surface. And those hard gelatin-sized papers were actually a lot more robust than we have today. And it meant that they didn't disintegrate to pulp. So they could actually take all of that sort of working back in all of the actual use of the actual sponges and all of that sort of extra surface treatment. So here's some nice pictures. So although the paper mills were distributed all the way through England, there was a continuous trade of hand-making paper that continued in Maidstone, Kent, England. And this is an area that had both water and in terms of rivers to actually power the actual paper mills, but it was also an area that was rich in limestone. So it produced a really good reserve of spring water to actually ensure bright white water to actually sort of create the actual pulp and to actually produce the paper itself. So it seems like a really idyllic setting. The actual business of making paper was a highly skilled, very labour intensive, very time consuming process. So what we have here on your right is actually just a beautiful illustration that was done by Paul Sansbury, and this actually just shows the actual operations of the actual paper mill. So we have here some of the features. So up the top here we actually have the lofts areas. So this is like a louvered system, so picking up the natural breezes for the final stage of the paper. And then underneath we actually have the actual paper mill itself, so it would have all of the vats. And then here you can actually see a small triangled area. So you've got the river flowing through, which will actually power the actual water mills to actually power it. But this is actually a natural spring, so that's where they would actually get the unpolluted water from. So this is just to give you a bit of a context in terms of how many mills were in this area. So this is up here at Tina. This is Turkey Mill up here, and what Moreton's actually had a number of different mills. But I'll just draw your attention to 14. So that's just a little bit further up. It's just here. This is where Haley Mill was, and that was actually run by the Greens brothers, and they had a sort of a collaborative arrangement in terms of working with the Watermans. As you'd appreciate, Watermans actually had a vast empire in terms of their production. I mean, basically they produced, in a very short period of time, they actually produced almost 10% of all of the actual paper that was actually being exported. It was a very big operation. They had 14 vats going, full time. It was really big. So when they had instances where they actually couldn't fulfil the orders, they would actually incorporate other paper mills to actually, they would loan their actual moulds that actually had the actual watermark of the Watermans and actually get them to help fulfil those actual orders. So this is just a show of the actual, this is the initial watermark itself. So this is one of the distinguishing features of a lot of fine art paper is their watermarks. And it's basically a translucent image. And so you can actually often see it when you actually hold it up to the light because that area is thinner in the application of the paper itself. So it starts off as the actual wire on the actual mould itself. And then once the actual paper is laid over it, and it actually helps distribute the actual pulp when it's actually in that process of actually coming out of the vat, it will actually fall either side of where that wire is on the actual mould itself. So traditionally watermarks were used to authenticate the good quality paper, as well as authenticate the actual mills that they actually were produced from. So as you can see here, sometimes what you found is that artists would actually use paper that was actually produced. They would actually get a whole batch of paper and then continue to actually use that same batch of paper. So, for instance, Turner used this watermark, which is from 1794, for about 50 years. And so the tank actually has a very substantial holding of Turner's watercolours, over 5,000. And so Peter Bowles, a paper historian who's able to actually categorise all of the actual watermarks and all the sort of the nuances of all of the sort of variations in those paper sheets. So this is what's also called a countermark, which was basically the date and the actual paper mill. And the reason why the date was incorporated was that the British government was trying to actually had just brought in terms of raising revenue. They actually brought in taxes for the actual paper mills to actually fund their overseas wars. And so that was a way of actually sort of being able to say, that's your quota. It's a bit like, would it be equivalent like a GST? It's a contemporary sort of comparison. So these watermarks are used by both paper historians and also paper conservators to authenticate papers and also verify the provenance of a lot of artworks. So as you can see, this is an example, like there's often a number of different sheet sizes, but this will just give you an understanding that not all artworks will actually have watermarks, and that's because of the positioning. You can see it's down here on your lower right, the actual watermark. So if you were actually to use a portion of that paper from that upper left corner, you would actually trim and actually not have the watermark included. So from the actual study that I did in terms of looking at all of the watercolours that were in transparent, I went through and actually, for those works that I could access the back, I was able to actually sort of do a bit of a chronology in terms of what papers different artists had actually used, and that way actually sort of, you know, just look at their use of paper choices as well. But of course, not every artwork has one on it, so it's a matter of actually a bit of detective work and actually even, for instance, one of the works that we looked at was a very sort of a mottled pattern, and I determined that was actually the Madstone Kent shield. So obviously something that's as detailed as that often sort of gets blurred by the actual paper pulp, and you actually don't get as fine a definition as that you'd like. So that's the reason why sometimes the watermark is also open to interpretation as well. So at the beginning of the 19th century, the demand for paper was increasing and the amount of available rags was decreasing. So alternative sources were used, such as cotton and straw and wood pulp, and they required harsh chemicals to actually treat the actual works in terms of excessive bleaching and to actually make them white and palatable. These papers were for general use and by use by amateur artists. However, professional artists continue to use handmade paper and rag paper for their artworks. So the process of actually processing these rags was actually very time consuming and predominantly done exclusively by women. So a lot of dirt, you know, you can imagine everyone's old rags, dirty, dusty job where you're actually getting a lot of lung complaints and respiratory, you didn't have the occupational health and safety that we have today. Rags were carefully sorted, but I mean there's certain instances where things like buttons went in the actual mix, and so sometimes you actually get things like brass buttons, actually sort of small nicks of the actual brass buttons being trapped in the actual pulp itself and contaminating the pulp. And so that's one of the actual contributing factors to what is known as foxing, where it actually sort of, there's small little corrosion points in the actual paper. You often see those on paper that's actually been contaminated in terms of the actual, so those little iron filings or brass filings will be distributed all the way through the paper pulp. So prior to the mid-1900s, the actual rags themselves were fermented, and so you actually had them sort of biologically cleaned. So, because you can imagine the actual rags were sourced from a number of different locations. And so they were boiled in lime for several hours to actually help break down the actual, the woven structure itself. So you've got just the raw fibres itself. So this treatment was called beating to a pulp. So this is what you've got here. You've got the the actual stamper, and that's where that expression comes from. So it's all those sort of things that still was retained into our language, but it's basically from the actual paper making trade. So the rags were actually stomped with these stampers, so you can imagine how noisy and it's a noisy, wet work, basically making paper. And the stompers were actually generated by the water wheels, so that sort of pounding process. So the linen pulp from the woven papers were superior to a lot of those other papers that had only short fibres. So the linen fibre, when you actually look under a microscope, it's very long, so it sort of entangles the actual sheet itself. So that's where the strength and robustness of the actual paper comes from. Very short fibres, you know, the actual linkages between the actual fibres themselves end up being very short. And we all know that in terms of the wood pulp, there's a lot of impurities in the actual wood pulp itself, and they act as an inherent vice in the actual paper itself and lead to its deterioration. So various stages of the paper production involved a lot of heavy work, so you can imagine really back-breaking work in terms of actually lifting. So it's not just one sheet, it's thousands of sheets a day, so you know, it's just incredible. So in terms of the actual production, if you can imagine travelling with that sheet of paper, it took almost 18 months from woe to go. So in terms of it, first going to the lady who's creating all of the fibres, to going into the vat, to actually being couched, you know, that whole process, because you know you're dealing not in a Queensland environment where it's like humid and things can dry out. You know, you're looking at it like a British climate where, you know, you're just really relying on a lot of air ventilation to dry things, and especially a lot of those larger sheets that have actually got that gelatin sizing on. You know, you're actually looking at almost 9 months of trying to completely dry out in those lofts. So by the second half of the 19th century, you've got a diminished supply of linen rags, and prompted by this search for, you know, more abundant, cheaper materials. But you've got more mechanisation coming through, so it's incorporated into the paper making production. So here you have the Hollander beater, so you actually had that for both handmade paper and also machine-made paper. So these Hollander beaters actually replaced the stampers that we saw first up. And the beating machines were the most significant innovation in that period. And they consisted of like a large oval vat, so basically sort of encouraging the actual pulp to actually be cycled through. You can see someone grading the actual pulp itself. So they're circulating around the tub, and then it also being processed. So for those papers that are actually produced with wood pulp, towards the end of the 19th century, you've got the Industrial Revolution, which is really starting to kick in, and the demand for paper is going sky high. So the cheaper methods of paper production were employed, and so you see larger equipment like this, which is the Furrow driver paper making machine, but it just didn't have the same capabilities as that hand feel of the four-way tilt of the actual handmade paper, and the distribution, that uneven distribution of the actual paper itself. And so for that particular reason, it was dictated by the market that it wasn't actually used for handmade paper. So they continued. So although the amount of paper mills actually started to disappear, obviously because there was a lot of, you know, a lot more mechanisation in terms of the general paper being made, you actually had those specialist mills like Watman's, like Green Brothers, that would actually sort of continue through. And they were basically serviced by the draftsmen, the architects, the surveyors, all of those areas, and then to professional artists were just a small portion of that niche market. So you also saw shortly after, you know, getting into the 20th century, shortly before the First World War, you actually had, you know, rags were just really diminished. So they had to actually look at a paper source that was more reliable. So they actually landed up going to cotton linter. Now cotton linter, just by it's actually an A grade quality product in the fact that it's actually the actual cotton fibres have actually been strung out rather than chopped, mechanically chopped, which was done sort of in that sort of 1850s period. So the quality of that raw material was much better. And so you actually had a purity of consistency, and you had very little modification in terms of what you needed to do in terms of usable pulp. And just this table here is actually sort of straddling both that 19th century, so looking at the sort of the linen component and all of those things in terms of, you know, the actual bleaching. You can actually see for now the actual coding for this so the RWS is the Royal Society of Watercolours, and this OW was a paper that they stipulated that they didn't want any bleaching. They wanted very little contaminants. And this one here, the Bockford, is actually one that was sort of produced from like 1980s onwards, and it was actually it has a lot more. You can see you've got a chlorine base. You've actually got these are internally sized, so a lot of in terms of even getting access to things like gelatin. It's still sort of a premium grade sizing material, and so in terms of like the finances, a lot of the paper mills actually had to look at efficiencies in terms of actually how they actually produced the actual paper itself. So what you actually had is, in terms of that Second World War period, you actually had the introduction of a machine that was called a cylinder mould machine, and it actually meant that it could actually replicate a lot of those, that hand tilt of the actual paper itself. It went a lot slower, but so you still actually sort of fed the actual pulp through, but you actually got the deckled edge that you actually was sort of symptomatic or sort of was a telltale sign of you know, just that it was actually a process that wasn't actually done with the Fourier driver machine. So differentiated machine-made paper, which was with the Fourier driver, which was sort of made for mass production, and the actual mould made machines were actually done with the cylinder situation. So after the Second World War, you actually got the school, you know, basically the impacts of both world wars meant that it had a devastating effect on the traditional paper making mills, because you had the expertise was lost, and in terms of the actual workforce was actually diminished. And so you actually had, even though you had production all the way through the wars, it was very much compromised in terms of their normal operations. So you had not only increasing labour costs after the war, but you also had lower sales in terms of, and this had a huge financial impact on the actual paper making industry. And so if they were to survive, they actually had to think smarter in terms of how they're actually going to produce paper. So that's where they came up with the dandy roll. So rather than the actual flat mould itself, it's actually on a cylinder. And so the mould cylinder process is a machine which mechanically, it actually imitates that stage that from both the vatman all the way through to the coucher, to the layer, and to even the action of the press actually coming down and driving the water out, and the loft drying. So you can see there's a number of stages. So you've got the dandy roll, and then this is it actually coming. These are two side by side, and then this is coming directly out of the vat. So these are under cylinder mould machines. So this is at St Cuthbert's mill. So the advantages of both the advantages for both the manufacturer and the end user was that you had more paper in a short amount of time. but you actually had more control over the actual production of the actual paper itself. So although it was technically perfect and evenly made, it was more reliable as well. So you didn't have the sort of the imperfections that you might have in terms of the handmade paper. Now there was, while this was happening, some people were die-hard in terms of what they really wanted handmade paper, and they liked all those nuances in terms of the unevenness of the pulp in some instances. So some of the artists actually really relished the individual characters of handmade paper. But for many things like when you're actually talking about doing large printing jobs, so like engravers, etchers, woodcut printers, you know, in terms of actually that even consistency of the actual paper itself, that's where this mould-made paper was really ideal. So unlike handmade paper, the actual mould-made paper wasn't restricted by size. In fact, you actually kept it on the roll, and so that is now the fashion in terms of often actually being able to get long lengths of the actual paper. So it will have a decal on the side, and you can actually sort of get it as a continuous roll. So there's actually so thank you very much for your attendance in terms of, we are actually planning a second part in terms of looking at watercolours from sort of the 1960s through to the current day. There's a number of contemporary artists that have actually sort of thoroughly enjoyed those larger sheet sizes, those massive, beautiful watercolours. So I'm thinking of artists like Dexter Dinci and all of those things, and that's where you know, the story of how the evolution of contemporary artist papers really kicks off, and that's where we sort of look at a lot of the changes in terms of the actual sizing, what companies have actually sort of done in terms of actually still being able to produce an affordable sheet of artist paper rather than the exorbitant cost, and you know, still make it available to artists. So we have a floor talk as part of the museum's day on the 18th of May, and that will actually just be going through and talking about the conservation treatments that we have for the actual behind the scenes in terms of getting these works in a presentable, displayable manner. And then later on in June, we actually have caring for watercolours. So if you have watercolours in your collection, that might be something that is of interest to you in terms of you know, how you actually sort of look at the selection of a lot of the materials in terms of the mounting and the display of works. So, so thank you very much.